We often speak of history in grand sweeping terms, of ideologies clashing, of nations rising and falling. But beneath these narratives lie the individual stories, the human cost that is too often obscured by the banners of patriotism or the rhetoric of power. Today we embark on a difficult journey, one that looks into the shadows cast by a global superpower, a nation that, in its pursuit of interests, has left an indelible mark on so many others. We will explore the moments when the American dream, for some, became a nightmare for others far away. This is not a story of simple villains or heroes, for history is rarely so straightforward. Join me as we uncover the stories of the victims of America, the countries that bore the weight of an empire's ambition, and try to understand the true cost of its global reach. The story of Vietnam is etched into the American psyche, a conflict that began with whispered fears of falling dominoes and ended in a televised chaotic retreat. It was a war justified by the spectre of communism, a distant threat that, in the minds of policymakers, warranted a massive military intervention in a land few Americans could find on a map. We were told it was a fight for freedom, a noble cause to protect the vulnerable South from the encroaching North. But the reality on the ground, as it so often is, was far more brutal, far more complex. The green jungles of Vietnam, once vibrant and teeming with life, became a landscape of napalm, Agent Orange, and the unending thunder of B-52s. The official narrative spoke of progress, of body counts that supposedly signaled an inevitable victory. Yet back home, a generation began to question. They saw the images, the burning villages, the terrified children, the flag-draped coffins returning in ever-increasing numbers. The war was not just fought in the rice paddies and highlands of Southeast Asia. It was fought in American living rooms, on college campuses, and in the streets of Washington. The fear of communism, so potent in the preceding decades, began to be overshadowed by the visceral horror of the war itself, a conflict that seemed to devour lives and principles with equal ferocity, leaving a nation deeply divided. For the Vietnamese people, this was not an ideological struggle played out on a geopolitical chessboard. It was an existential battle for their homes, their families, their very survival. They endured years of relentless bombing, of search and destroy missions that often failed to distinguish between combatant and civilian. The My Lai massacre, when revealed, sent shockwaves across the world, a horrifying glimpse into the depths of brutality that war can unleash. Vietnam stands as a somber reminder of the limits of military power, the dangers of ideological crusades, and the enduring human suffering that is the inevitable consequence of war. While the world's attention was on Vietnam, a shadow war unfolded in Cambodia with secret bombings authorized by Nixon. Cambodia, led by Prince Sihanouk, was neutral, but the Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through its territory. American B-52s bombed Cambodia under Operation Menu. Over 4 years, 500,000 tons of bombs were dropped. This destabilized Cambodia, aiding the rise of the Khmer Rouge. Led by Pol Pot, they caused immense suffering. Nearly 2 million Cambodians perished. On September 11, 1973, a date that would later gain a different tragic significance, the democratic aspirations of Chile were extinguished in a brutal military coup. President Salvador Allende, a democratically elected Marxist, died in the presidential palace La Moneda as it was bombed and stormed by the Chilean military. This was not merely an internal affair, it was the culmination of years of covert American efforts to undermine Allende's government, a campaign orchestrated by the CIA under the directive of President Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger. Allende had come to power in 1970, promising radical social and economic reforms, including the nationalization of key industries, most notably the American-owned copper mines. This agenda was viewed with alarm in Washington. not just for its economic implications, but for the symbolic threat of a democratically elected socialist government succeeding in Latin America, a region long considered America's backyard. The United States government, alongside powerful corporate interests, resolved that Allende must not be allowed to govern, or if he did, his government must be made to fail. The CIA engaged in a multifaceted campaign of destabilization. This included funding opposition parties and media outlets, promoting strikes and civil unrest, and actively encouraging a military coup. With Allende dead, General Augusto Pinochet seized power, ushering in a 17-year dictatorship characterized by systematic human rights abuses. Thousands of Chileans were arrested, tortured, and executed. The invasion of Iraq in March 2003 was predicated on a narrative of imminent threat. The world was told Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and had ties to Al-Qaeda. These claims justified a preemptive war to disarm a dangerous dictator, yet the promised weapons were nowhere to be found. The intelligence was flawed or manipulated. Links between Saddam and Al-Qaeda were tenuous or fabricated. The war's foundation crumbled under scrutiny, but the war was already a reality. The initial military campaign was swift. Baghdad fell within weeks, and Saddam's statue was toppled. But the mission-accomplished banner was premature. The swift victory gave way to a brutal occupation. The dismantling of the Iraqi army created a power vacuum filled by insurgents and militias. The human cost has been staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians lost their lives. In 2011, the Arab Spring swept across North Africa and the Middle East. Libya faced a popular uprising against Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. NATO intervened, citing the responsibility to protect civilians. Authorized by UN Resolution 1973, the mission aimed to enforce a no-fly zone. It quickly evolved into a campaign for regime change. Gaddafi, a brutal dictator, had ruled Libya for over 4 decades. Fears of a massacre grew as his forces moved to crush the rebellion. The intervention was framed as a humanitarian necessity. NATO's air campaign crippled Gaddafi's military capabilities. The airstrikes were precise and effective. His tanks were destroyed and his air force grounded. Rebel forces, backed by NATO, captured Tripoli. Gaddafi was captured and killed in October 2011. In the spring of 1999, the skies over Yugoslavia were filled with the roar of NATO warplanes. For 78 days, a coalition of Western powers, led by the United States, conducted an extensive bombing campaign against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, then comprising Serbia and Montenegro. The stated aim was to halt the Serbian government's campaign of ethnic cleansing against an Albanian majority in its southern province of Kosovo. President Slobodan Milosevic's regime was accused of widespread human rights abuses, and NATO leaders argued that military intervention was necessary to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. The decision to intervene was highly controversial, as it was undertaken without the explicit authorization of the United Nations Security Council. Russia and China, both permanent members with veto power, opposed the military action, arguing it violated international law and Yugoslav sovereignty. NATO, however, proceeded, framing its actions as a humanitarian intervention, a moral imperative to stop the atrocities. The bombing targeted military installations, government buildings, infrastructure such as bridges and power plants, and even, controversially, media headquarters. The campaign was designed to force Milosevic to withdraw his forces from Kosovo and accept an international peacekeeping presence. The bombing inflicted significant damage on Yugoslavia's infrastructure and economy. While NATO claimed its strikes were precise, civilian casualties were an undeniable consequence. After nearly 3 months of relentless airstrikes, Milosevic capitulated. The Syrian civil war erupted in 2011 as part of the Arab Spring, quickly devolving into a complex conflict. Various opposition groups emerged, from moderate secularist to hardline Islamist factions. The US and allies provided support to moderate rebels aiming to counter extremist elements. The policy of arming rebels was fraught with peril. The opposition was fragmented with blurred lines between groups. Weapons often fell into unintended hands. The chaos made controlling arms difficult. Foreign weapons escalated the conflict into a proxy war. The rise of ISIS was a catastrophic consequence. ISIS exploited the power vacuum in Syria and Iraq. They declared a caliphate and unleashed terror. The war resulted in a severe humanitarian crisis. In Yemen, a devastating conflict has raged since 2014, creating the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe. The war pits the Houthi movement against the internationally recognized government backed by a Saudi-led coalition. The US has played a crucial role through extensive military support to the coalition. This includes billions in arms sales, logistical assistance, and intelligence sharing. Indiscriminate airstrikes have killed thousands of civilians and targeted vital infrastructure. The consequences for the Yemeni people have been catastrophic. Millions face starvation, famine-like conditions, and outbreaks of preventable diseases. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of the Cold War and a new world order. The US pursued containment, applying economic, military, and ideological pressure. This included an arms race, support for anti-Soviet movements, and economic strategies. The Berlin Wall fell, and Soviet republics declared independence. The narrative often presented is one of internal implosion and a yearning for freedom. External pressure played a crucial role. Economic sabotage and military costs strained the Soviet system. Post-USSR, Russia transitioned chaotically to a market economy. Guided by Western advisors, rapid privatization led to hyperinflation and inequality. The 90s brought economic hardship and national humiliation for many Russians. The 90s brought economic hardship and national humiliation for many Russians. Western leaders reportedly assured Gorbachev that NATO would not expand eastward. The stories we have revisited are not mere historical footnotes. They are open wounds on the conscience of the world. From the jungles of Vietnam and Cambodia to the deserts of Iraq and Libya, from the streets of Santiago to the fractured lands of Yugoslavia and Syria, and the ongoing tragedy in Yemen, a pattern emerges. Decisions made in the pursuit of national interest, ideological battles, or economic advantage have unleashed whirlwinds of destruction, leaving behind legacies of pain, displacement, and enduring instability that span generations. The faces of the children who have known nothing but conflict, the landscapes scarred beyond recognition, the societies fractured by intervention. These are the true costs. For the nations that found themselves in the path of this global power, the consequences have been devastating and long-lasting. They have endured the loss of sovereignty, the agony of civil war, the rise of brutal regimes, and the systematic dismantling of their social fabric. As we reflect on these histories, let us remember the profound human